เชิญคุณมาร์ค ซักเซอร์เริ่มต้นเปิดเวทีวันนี้ครับ
สวัสดีครับพูดภาษาไทยไม่ได้ครับ so this will be in English and that's why you have this thing. So please make good use of it. First of all, let me thank our co-organizers here. I'm very proud that we can do this together with TDRI. This is not just a regular event, but this is actually the outcome of 4 years of work that we've been doing together, and I'm really proud that we came so far. Also, I'm delighted that I have the opportunity to discuss with some of the brightest minds of Thailand here today. So bear with me and let's see how this goes. We have a tight moderation. I've been told that I only have 20 minutes, so without any further ado, I think I will start the presentation. I will, in the first half, lay out the way, maybe a different reading of corruption, particularly in what we call transformation societies. And the second half of the presentation talk a little bit about the situation in Thailand, I think, which brings us up to date. So fighting corruption in transformation societies, that immediately needs some explanation. So what is a transformation society? So basically, the way that you can look at transformation crisis is that the political conflict, the immediate conflict that you see, the red-yellow street protests and what's going on in the newspapers, is only the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper transformation crisis. So what is a transformation crisis? Transformation crises occur when your economy and your society are modernizing rapidly and the political and normative order has not been adapted yet. So the gap between the modern economy and society and the traditional political and normative order, that's where the crisis really comes from. I think Antonio Gramsci did that in this beautiful quote when he said, when the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born, demons, monsters come to dance. And I think this is a little bit what a transformation crisis is all about. So basically, it's this coexistence between a modern order and a pre-modern order, modern ideas, pre-modern ideas, a modern economy, a pre-modern economy that defines this time and age. And as we will see in a minute, this has happened all over the world, and it's happening in Thailand today. So Thailand is much less unique as you may think it is. Just very quickly, what is the actual transformation? What is really changing? And why is this change irresistible and inevitable? First of all, you have a structural change that has to do with your economy. The economy over the last 30 years did not only grow from an agricultural backwater into an upper middle income, semi-industrialized economy, which is deeply integrated in the global division of labor, which means it's got bigger. The point, it's got much more complex in terms of the information flows that have to be managed, the signals that have to be picked up. That is overstretching a political system which is highly concentrated, where only a few people have the authority to make decisions. That is the first structural change. The second change is normative. If you look around you and you picture a traditional society, so you would have been a monk or a merchant or a farmer and maybe a warrior, and today you're journalists and think tankers and heart surgeons and yoga trainers. So the society gets much more colorful, different lifestyle arises with these lifestyle, new interests, new worldviews, new values, which means, in a nutshell, more noise. Pluralistic societies are diverse and noisy all the time, and particularly East Asian societies, or maybe particularly Thai culture, has a problem dealing with that because the traditional political culture is built around notions of unity, harmony, unanimity, and this noise, this conflict, this constant debate is simply eroding the normative order. Third, of course, and I think this is what's the easiest to see, is that change creates winners and losers. So you have conflict between winners and losers, you have conflict between the top and the bottom of society, you have conflict between the center and the periphery, and you have, as I said, the coexistence of ideas, two sides who both believe, and Ajahn Pokbong mentioned this already, it's like a holy war. There's two rivaling claims to represent the one and only universal truth. We call that the politics of truth, and it creates a lot of trouble. All of these things overstretch a traditional political system which has been built for a different time, with different needs and different functions, and is not working anymore in a modern society. So the first thing, let me please say that a transformation crisis is the direct result of your success. Your success of 30 years of double-digit growth or whatever it is, which built this fantastic city. This is why the growing pain is coming right now. It's not the end of the world. Many other societies have gone through that, and you will as well. So what's happening historically, I will go into detail a little bit more in a second, but there is a transgression, a transformation, where you can say that small band-level traditional societies are built on personal relationships between blood relatives, your uncle, your father, your brother, your cousin, right? When societies grow bigger, they build their political system upon still personal relationships, but they don't have to be blood relatives anymore. So usually it's the patron and client relationship. You can call that feudalism if you want, but I don't mean it in a historical sense. I mean it in this, that there is a personal relationship of protection versus loyalty between two people who have a personal bond. So this is how more complex societies organize their political system. And finally, when societies start to number in the millions and start to develop complex and globalized economies, there is the need to make the political system more abstract, stop the personal relationships, and build it upon general principles of legality and rationality. So that is a certain transformation that all developed nations have gone through, and this is also what's happening here in this country. And Thailand is almost through. As you can see, I said Thailand is here. You already have legalistic, rationalistic institutions. There is some sort of rule of law, but it's not there yet. And that is exactly the point. The point is the coexistence. You can say that behind the glossy facades of your institutions, the glossy facades of the rule of law and this legalistic, rationalistic institution is still the old social order organized around personal relationship, and the word for that is the patronage system. And the patronage system lurks behind those facades and is actually what really governs life. And I think all of you know that there is one thing which is the official version, and there is another Thailand which is the unofficial version, and I think sometimes we know which one prevails in the end. So here's the problem. A small society can be built on personal relationships, maybe must be built in personal relationships because that's the only institutions that you got. And you can check that in your personal life. If you go to the street and you eat some somtam, you know the guy who sells it, so you know you're not going to be poisoned. And your mother probably knows the dentist of the family, and your father maybe knows some guy in the administration who can bail you out when you get in trouble. So you know that in your personal life, personal relationships work. And in a situation where institutions are not yet efficient, are yet not effective, maybe that phone call is the only thing that works. The problem is this: when a society becomes more complex, when a society becomes more complicated and bigger, you cannot do this anymore, because every time you make that phone call, the abstract rule of law is undermined, the rationality of the decision is undermined, the legality of the decision is undermined. So at a certain point of development, corruption patronage system, which to a certain degree was functional or helpful in older societies, now becomes a bottleneck of modernization. What used to be functional, and I would say this, since the dawn of humankind, since humans first roamed the earth, we have been building our relationships upon personal relationships. So that's almost a human default level. Now we reach a point in history where that's no longer possible, and this is where corruption becomes a problem. So it is also not a coincidence that at the very same point of time where corruption becomes a functional problem, suddenly the attitudes, the perception of these corrupt practices change. So let's just, spell out what is a patronage system. What does a patron have to do if he wants to stay a patron for long? Well, he has to reward his allies, he has to protect his clients, he has to favor his kin, he has to distribute the stuff that he can collect, the spoils, he has to cut out the non-supporters, and he has to crush his opponents. This is what patrons do. But out of a sudden, a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, rewarding allies, this is populism. Favoring kin, this is nepotism. And distributing spoils, that's corruption. So the attitudes change first, and the laws change later, and a social practice which is thousands of years old suddenly becomes illegal and becomes, as in the discourse of Thailand, the biggest problem to development in Thailand. Let me be very clear, I'm not saying it's not the biggest problem for development in Thailand, but first of all, we have to appreciate this fundamental change in attitudes, which is not a coincidence. So in an abstract speaking, what you have to do is to upgrade your operating system just the same way as you do it with your computer, because what that computer is supposed to do is more complicated now, so you need an upgrade of the operating system. What used to be built on personal relationships now needs to go into the system of abstractions governed by the principles of legality and rationality. And there's a word for that. We call it good governance. I think you've all seen those before. And this is just another way of saying what Max Weber called the modernization of the state. And what's also interesting is who is pushing for these changes, who is pushing for this modernization, is usually the middle class, because the elites have a lot to gain from the patronage system, which makes them very, very rich. And for the poor, the patronage system sometimes is the only thing that helps them to survive. So the change, the push for modernization, the push for accountability and transparency and good governance and all that stuff usually comes from the middle class, and that would be the conventional expectation that the middle class is pushing for modernization. So now, look at Thailand. Look at what happened here. Is that what's happening? Is the middle class pushing for modernization? If corruption really is the abuse of power for personal gain, if corruption is what a patron is doing to smooth his patronage network, wouldn't it mean that standing up to corruption means to empower people to stand up to the abuse of power? And wouldn't it mean that you need deeper and more democracy and not less? Wouldn't it mean that you have to curb the old patronage system and modernize the state structure instead of strengthening the people who want to stop modernization and go back to a traditional system? So that's a puzzle, right? And we have to explain that why the middle class, who we think should be one pushing for modernization, is somehow on the other side. So let me say this. Transformations are not a technical thing. They are not a natural process where the old order is collapsing and something else is emerging out of it. Transformations are political struggles, particularly those who benefit and want to uphold the status quo, and those who want change. This is what determines the process. This is why it's messy and it's going back and forth, and this is why it takes so long, and this is why our friends here who are scientists are sometimes frustrated that exactly the opposite is happening what they've been saying for so many years. And I think some of you in the audience share that feeling. It's a struggle. And who wins that struggle will determine the outcome. So we don't know the outcome yet. And I hate to say it, it's not necessarily so that the outcome is democracy. It can be something else. So winning the struggle really matters. And in that struggle, what's very interesting is that the middle class, and to be more precise, the established middle class in Bangkok is siding with the traditional elites and the social conservatives. This is what we've been seeing in this country, and I think this needs to be explained. And the first way to explain something is to listen to people. And I think the discourse of the middle class is this. It has 5 elements. It's a discourse of fear. The middle class is afraid that corrupt politicians rob their money to buy the votes of the greedy poor with populist projects. That is the fear of the middle class, and this is what is bringing the middle class into the conservative political camp. As I said, Thailand is not unique. There's a long list of countries here. I'm not going to read it out right now. It would take too much time. But what's quite remarkable, and the list is actually longer, I just didn't have more space on the slide. All of these crises look remarkably similar, and they go something like this. First of all, these are not developing countries. All of them we would call emerging markets, emerging countries. I call them transformation societies. This means there has been already 20 or 30 years of solid socio-economic development, and in most of them, with a notable exception of the Arab Spring countries, have already installed something which you can call a liberal democracy, or at least elections. The democracy may be dysfunctional, but somehow the elections matter. So in that situation, clever political entrepreneurs come to the side. And they don't share much of an ideology or objective or whatsoever. If you think about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who called himself a Bolivarian socialist, or if you think about Morsi in Egypt, or Erdogan in Turkey, who call themselves Islamists or moderate Islamists, or Thaksin, who may be called the neoliberal tycoon or whatever, they don't share much in terms of outlook and ideology. What combines them is that they have understood that when the provinces are emerging, it's a very good electoral strategy to cater to the demands and needs and wishes and hopes of the majority of the people who live in the provinces. And this is why they win one election after the other, and they're actually being helped by establishment parties who cannot figure that out. If you don't believe me, look to Venezuela and Turkey. And I'm not saying there's a party in Bangkok which doesn't understand that. But basically, this is why they win election after election after election. However, and this is why Joshua Kulonjic called them elected autocrats, these new leaders act and behave the very same way as everyone else because they are patrons. So they are rewarding allies, and they're favoring kin, and they're protecting their clients, and they're distributing spoils, and they're cutting out those who do not support them, which in Thailand was the South, and they're crushing their enemies. Now the problem is this: in a liberal democracy, your enemies can be the opposition. It can be the courts, it can be the independent commissions, it can be the media, it can be civil society, and these people happen to be middle class, and these things are the safeguards, the protections of the middle class. So the middle class has a problem now. There is all these unwashed masses in the provinces who want something, their money, and those elites who are threatening them and they feel being crushed in the middle. And this is where the middle class paranoia comes from. And guess what? In all of those crises that I showed you, the middle classes go to the streets by the hundreds of thousands and want to be someone to take care of that problem because they cannot win elections. So guess who's stepping in? Well, of course, it's going to be the traditional elites and their friends in the military and the judiciary. And the irony is this, that as long as a transformation conflict is not resolved, it will continue. So don't be surprised that Mr. Chen in Taiwan and Mr. Erdogan in Turkey and Mr. Chavez in Venezuela and Mr. Thaksin in Thailand always come back because some people have invested in him. And that's what a transformation crisis is all about. But we stay with the middle class. So what is interesting about the middle class in Bangkok, and I mean the established middle class, is that from the 1990s, where we had in 1992 a middle class uprising which led to the so-called People Constitution 1997, which was really a middle class constitution, a liberal democracy. So they were firmly in the camp pro-change and political order which was built on the consent of the ruled. And suddenly now we have a lot of people in the middle class, and it's sometimes exactly the same people. The same people who in 1997 were building a democracy, who now say democracy does not fit Thai society. So what happened is that the middle class switched sides, and they now go towards the pole of order. This is because Thaksin threatened them. And they now goes towards the pole of morality. Rule legitimized by morality of the ruler, which is a traditional pre-modern discourse. So now we're back to the discourse again. If you want to understand the political red-yellow, you have to answer another puzzle. And this other puzzle is, how do these odd alliances actually stick together for so long? I mean, you know, the yellow side, royalists and former communists and militaries and labor. On the one side, on the other hand, you have capitalists and you have progressive intellectuals and you have godfathers. So they don't make sense, these two alliances, but they've been around for quite a while. So the usual answer would be, yeah, that's because their patrons want it and the rest is just foot soldiers. Well, that's half true. But I think more importantly, they are being held together by living in the same discourse world. And I think it's interesting to see what I say, the coexistence of two philosophies, two concepts, two visions, two set of ideas, two discourses is what defines a transformation crisis. So listen in the yellow discourse, because that one is the one where the established middle class in Bangkok belongs to. It is rooted in a cosmology that was developed in the Ayutthaya period in the former Siam kingdom. And it's a particular interpretation of Theravada Buddhism, but it has nothing to do with religion. It's a political discourse, and it goes like this. A bad ruler brings suffering into the world. A good ruler brings happiness into the world, which means the difference between the two is a quality which resides within the ruler. And that what resides within the ruler is morality, barami, right? So that means if you look at the political crisis out there not as 30 years of growth and development, but as decay, moral and social decay, then the recipe for overcoming this crisis would be to restore morality. And if morality resides within the person of the ruler or within the people, well, then you have to exchange bad people with no morality with good people with high moral integrity. And this is then what you call reform. And this is why reform have to come before elections. because, and that is something that really, I think this is the most important thing I'm going to say today. Thailand is particular in the respect that there is an equation between corruption and democracy in the discourse. In this country, people who are corrupt are the politicians, the elected politicians. That's what they say. So everyone who's not corrupt is not a politician. It's easy as that, right? So that's very interesting. But this equation between corruption and democracy in the discourse, not in the reality, in the discourse, is what is actually bringing the middle class to the other side. So let's look at what's happening in action, right? What we've been seeing over the last couple of months. So how is rule legitimized and what is actually the reform philosophy? Well, rule by moral people brings happiness into the world. That's the official reform philosophy that we hear. So what does that mean for the political system? What needs to be done? How does the reform agenda have to be structured? Well, number one, a good order is where the good people rule, which is why you have to weed out and root out and clean up the old bureaucratic polity. Bureaucratic polity is also called Thai democracy, and this is what you had before 1992. If you go a little bit more radical, you call it democracy, and I know that there is some people who promote that, and that means, okay, first thing we have to clean up the bureaucratic polity and root out the bad people, and then we have to make sure that the bad people don't come creeping back in, which why we have to build a firewall around the political system so these bad people don't come back in. And who are those bad people? They are elected politicians. So we have to make sure that the elected politicians don't come back. How do you fight corruption with a mindset like that? Well, like I said, you exchange the bad people who are politicians with good people who are not politicians. I think you've heard a lot of people saying that they're not politicians lately. What I found the most particular is that the Anti-Corruption Commission is actually saying that the National Reform Council members are not politicians, they're academics, which means they're good people. And that's how it goes. What we hear from that very council is that the way to fight corruption is to restore moral integrity. Restoring moral integrity is the way to clean up corruption in the conservative mindset. And that is actually what's happening if we look at the action. Well, number one, there's a crackdown on vice, prostitution, gambling, small scale, frauds, etc. So that is legitimizing rule. And we have an education reform, the so-called 12 values, who are also stressing moral integrity. So this is basically the script. The problem is this: if you do that, if you basically restore the status quo ante, if you strike a deal or no deal or whatever, and you say, let's return stability and deal with the rest later, it means that you create a bottleneck for modernization. It means that all the things that have to happen now for Thailand to survive when the ASEAN Economic Community starts in 2 months, education reform, infrastructure reform, social policy, social peace, modernization of the administration, are probably put to the backbench. And what could happen then is that you flatline. Doesn't mean that you have to do that inevitably, but the danger is you end up like Argentina or Egypt, a country which has not managed to solve the riddles, the political and social riddles of modernization and transformation. So that's why I'm saying that you can only modernize a political system within a mind frame a political culture which is democratic. And this is why I'm saying Thailand, when it really comes to fighting corruption, does not have a hardware problem. We have nice institutions. Most of that stuff that you need is already here. You don't have a hardware problem, you have a software problem. It is the patronage culture which runs these institutions, which makes them behave like a patron and in the patronage system. So the culture, the political culture has to be changed to make those institutions work effectively. That's my last slide. This is why the fight against corruption has to be part of the modernization of the state. And this is why it has to be part and parcel as the fight for democracy. It's the only way to fight corruption is to strengthen those who stand up to the abuse of power. It's the only way to push back the patronage system, because corruption is not a flaw. It's not a coincidence. It's the DNA, it's the working mechanism of the patronage system. So the equation corruption equals democracy is wrong. It's completely wrong. Corruption equals patronage. And the solution for patronage is a real democracy, because you want to empower people to stand up against the abuse of power by the powerful. This is how it works, and this is where I stop. ขอบคุณมากครับ
Mark, I have one question for you. How can we get the middle class on board with the Democratic Alliance again?
Well, like I said, the middle class is scared. So number one, you have to take them serious. I know they have been saying a lot of things lately, which may be not so pleasant, but the point is, if people are threatened, they act aggressively. So the grievances of the middle class is number one, that they are threatened if you take away their political safeguards. So a discourse which focuses only on majority rule, you know, he who has might is always right, the majority is always right, the majority can do whatever it wants, will scare the middle class and bring them to the other camp. So this is why, indeed, democracy is more than just majority rule. And the second thing is you have to get the middle class on board in giving them a stake in development. And I think the tragedy of Thailand right now is that really no one has a stake in development. I think too many people, too many influential people, too many classes have a stake in the status quo. So only when people see that modernization, the bright future, the good society is for them to struggle for, but they have something to gain, only then they will actually do it. Otherwise, it's a little bit the devil you know versus the devil you don't know, so you rather stay with the status quo, right? So you have to give the middle class something in return. And this has a lot to do, and this is my last slide here. Political development, economic development, and social peace are the same thing. You cannot just have economic development. And this has to do with Thailand's economy. I mean, now we're all talking that your growth rates are going down and somehow it's not nice anymore like it used to be in the 80s. So why is that? Well, basically, Thailand has been going strong on what you call extractive growth, right? Industrialization, export cheap labor. So basically what happens is you exploit your natural resources and you move your workforce from the agricultural sector into the industrial sector, and that gives you huge productivity gains, and that gives you 3 decades or something of strong growth, which means that at some point that's exhausted. That's not the end of the world. Japan, Taiwan, Korea will solve that riddle by what you call moving up the value chain. The problem is that when you move up the value chain, you hit the class ceiling. It's called the middle income trap. The middle income trap basically means that now that you want to have high technology and higher yield services, etc., you need to invest in the human resources. A lot. Education, infrastructure, public services cost a lot of money. Where does the money come from? Well, you can tax the rich, but the problem is that's not enough. So you have to tax the middle class. If you look at the numbers, the middle class, the revenue from tax versus GDP in Thailand is 16.5% right now. OECD average is 33. So that means you would almost have to double the tax. Can you imagine that anyone right now would be willing to do that? No. Because they know I don't get anything in return for that. That's populism, vote buying, etc. So that means if you want to go to the next level of economic development, you need a new political formula which allows the classes to buy in this new society. And that's what you call a social contract. And this is why you cannot get to the next economic development level without solving the political and social riddles. It's really important. So making a win-win offer, giving something in return, that is what you have to do, and taking care of their grievances and fears. And I think this is the bottleneck, and this is why the middle income trap is really a political trap.
Mark, people say Thai business community seems not to care about democracy. They said if the economy is growing, it's okay, no matter what regime. How would you respond to that?
Like I said, Thailand is running on an extractive growth model. That means the few are extracting resources from the many, which means that the few have an interest to keep exactly everything the way it is, because that is just good enough. The problem is this: if this is your political economy, you create a bottleneck for development. This is the opposite of what's needed. The modernization of the state, continuous innovation in the business sector is what you need to survive globally. But domestically, they don't have to, because two large segments of the Thai economy are protected from competition, so for them it doesn't matter. So, of course, too many people in the business sector are happy, because for them, they have a lot to win and very little to lose. But Thailand has a lot to lose. You have to solve that riddle, otherwise you get stuck.
ขอบคุณครับ คุณมาร์คบอกเรานะครับว่าคอร์รัปชันเป็นอาการของโรคร้ายที่ใหญ่โตกว่าคือโรคที่ติดพันเรื้อรังมาจากระบอบศักดินาอุปถัมภ์ที่อยู่บนสายสัมพันธ์ส่วนตัวนะครับไม่ได้อยู่บนฐานของกฎหมายและเหตุผลและล้าหลังเกินไปที่จะตอบโจทย์ใหม่ในสังคมสมัยใหม่และสังคมประชาธิปไตยนะครับคุณมาร์คยังบอกด้วยว่าคอร์รัปชันเนี่ยเป็นปัญหาทางการเมืองเป็นเรื่องของความไม่เท่าเทียมเชิงอำนาจเป็นเรื่องของความอายุติธรรมทางสังคมนะครับเป็นปัญหาเชิงระบบเชิงโครงสร้างที่ไปไกลกว่าเรื่องศีลธรรมส่วนบุคคลการแก้ปัญหาคอร์รัปชันต้องแก้ด้วยวิถีทางประชาธิปไตยไม่ใช่หันหลังให้กับประชาธิปไตยนะครับมาร์คบอกว่าสมการที่สังคมไทยจำเป็นต้องคิดใหม่คือการต่อต้านคอร์รัปชันต้องเท่ากับการต่อสู้เพื่อสร้างประชาธิปไตยให้อย่างรากลึกในสังคมสร้างความยุติธรรมทางสังคมและสร้างรัฐสมัยใหม่บนฐานของกฎหมายและเหตุผลสร้างสังคมที่ให้ผลตอบแทนตามผลงานและความสามารถเหนือสายสัมพันธ์ส่วนตัวคุณมาร์คสรุปสุดท้ายว่าการต่อสู้คอร์รัปชันเนี่ยนะครับมีความเป็นการเมืองมีการต่อสู้เชิงวัฒกรรมแฝงอยู่ไม่ได้บริสุทธิ์ผุดผ่องนะครับและในบางกรณีส่งผลทำลายประชาธิปไตยและหลักนิติธรรมและถูกใช้เป็นเครื่องมือทางการเมืองของชนชั้นนำในการรักษาอำนาจนะครับคุณมาร์คสรุปว่าการต่อสู้กับคอร์รัปชันจะสำเร็จได้ต้องสร้างแนวร่วมทางสังคมที่กว้างขวางต้องผนวกรวมการต่อสู้กับคอร์รัปชันเข้ากับประชาธิปไตยและการสร้างความยุติธรรมในสังคมนะครับและต้องใช้วัฒกรรมประชาธิปไตยไปสู้กับวัฒกรรมศีลธรรมไปสู้กับวัฒกรรมอำนาจนิยมนะครับกล่าวคือต้องเป็นประชาธิปไตยให้มากขึ้นไม่ใช่น้อยลงและที่สำคัญต้องดึงชนชั้นกลางกลับมาเป็นแนวร่วมของฝ่ายประชาธิปไตยอีกครั้งหนึ่งนะครับก็เป็นประเด็นที่น่าคิดมากเลยนะครับผมขอเคลื่อนไปที่